Good morning. Welcome to Fantasy Sports today on Super Bowl Sunday. I'm Craig Mish, and along with my esteemed cast of characters, boy, do we have a supersized edition of the show today, 8 a.m. to 12 p.m. Eastern, reviewing everything going on for the Super Bowl and in fantasy sports. And as you can see, for those of you who were children of the 70s, it's like a Brady Bunch edition of the show. As you can see to my lower, to my left, to my right, I got friends on high places, low places, everywhere you could possibly go. Gentlemen, it is great to be with you here on the show, and I'm going to start off in a different way. Normally, I'm on every Saturday morning with Davis Maddock, but today, my old co-host, or should I say my new co-host, my past co-host, my present, my future, and Joe Pisapia, who I've been doing shows with now for 2 decades, is back with me for 4 hours today. Joe, I'm going to start with you. Good morning. Thanks for popping in on your show today and letting me be a part of it.
Yeah, that's what it feels like. You're in my house now, Craig Mish. Yeah, where's the Kembe Mutombo when you need him? No. I know you love that. That's your favorite thing. 2 decades, that's a long time. I told you years ago, you're just never going to get rid of me no matter how hard you try, and you've tried very, very hard in the last 2 decades, yet still here I am, and I'm happy that we're all here today for a 4-hour Fantasy Sports Today action spectacular. Matt Stryker and I usually handle the Sundays. You and Davis handle the Saturdays, but this is a big game today, so you need all of the Fantasy Sports Today people in one place, and I think it's going to be a fantastic show.
Yeah, it will be. And let's now move over to my co-host, Davis Maddock, because he's going to be the only nervous one on Super Bowl Sunday. Those of you who are making bets, of course, are going to be nervous, but there's only one person really rooting for a team today amongst us four. And Davis, of course, roots for the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, in hosting with Davis all season long, folks, for those of you who are watching, he's going to give you full transparency. There was no chance Davis thought we would be here on Super Bowl Sunday with his Kansas City Chiefs playing in the Super Bowl, Davis. Let's get real.
No. I mean, that Denver loss, I think the Denver loss, I was like, you know what? Let's pack it up, guys. Let's keep everyone healthy. Let's get Travis back for the age 35 season. Make sure Mahomes doesn't get injured. Let's get some wide receivers in this room. And I think I learned a great lesson, which is when the chips are down, don't bet against Andy Reid. Don't bet against Patrick Mahomes. I think, obviously the comparison that everyone is making on social media these days is those Pats dynasty teams where they would just look like crap. They'd get blown out by 30 by the Dolphins on the road in October. And then, lo and behold, end of the season, they win the division and they make their run to the playoffs again. So you're right, Craig. I am very nervous, but it's a great place to be in the last game of the season. Your team is in it, and I'm excited to chat with you guys.
Yeah, very, very excited for all of us as well. And then, of course, last but certainly not least, a gentleman, a scholar. Before the end of the show, you're going to be writing down or putting in your phone some words of wisdom for the effervescent Matt Stryker, back with us for another edition of Fantasy Sports Today. And Matt, it was wonderful working with you over the last couple of years. Your wisdom has brought me such success in fantasy and in sports betting. What are the words of wisdom, Matt, as we begin a 4-hour extravaganza here on Super Bowl Sunday?
I appreciate that introduction. Thank you so much. I stand amongst the rogues gallery. Guys, I got to tell you, personally, for me, this show is special. Davis, I believe you're the first person with whom I've ever done a studio show for this network. Craig, as I've told you in the past, I've always revered your pedigree more so than anything. Just the way you report with honesty always helped me out. And Joe, listen, I mean, we don't have as much time as we're going to need to speak about how great and wonderful you and I have been. So overall, it's going to be fantastic. And now that I know that Davis is a Chiefs fan, this is going to be even more interesting, guys, because I got to tell you, I'm kind of rooting the other way. Craig?
Yeah, San Francisco 49ers, and I think that's probably a good place to start. So if we rewind 1 week ago, or I probably should say 2 weeks ago, honestly, we had a pretty solid line where the 49ers were 2.5-point favorites. And that's pretty much the way that it rolled, Joe, for the last couple of weeks. All of a sudden now, we finally, here on, let's say, Super Bowl Sunday or Saturday night, are starting to see some pullback. The most money being bet on one side in the Super Bowl is the Kansas City Chiefs. But as we know, Joe, that doesn't always mean that that's the right side. That is the public side right now. As we take a look at the odds, The 49ers in some spots are down to just 1-point favorites. They are 1.5 in some spots. You can get Kansas City +2 just depending on where you're betting the game. But, Joe, that's a pretty significant movement leading up to a Super Bowl. Generally, you don't see any movement leading up to a Super Bowl. The line is pretty much stuck. And here we go. All of a sudden, people are starting to back the Chiefs.
Yeah, at BetMGM right now, you can get that +2 that you're talking about. That's available right now. I'm looking at the best lines you can get over at bettingpros.com, and you can see in San Fran, the -1.5. You can get an ESPN bet at -105. Look, you're right. Usually these lines kind of do lock in, but at the same time, we're also looking at an enormous amount of money, 70% almost, coming in on the Chiefs, which usually is one of those things where you, myself, I'm sure Davis, and especially Matt like to fade the public, but immediately from the jump, I would say that the Chiefs is where I want it to be personally too, because to Davis's earlier point, when you're talking about Andy Reid and you're talking about Patrick Mahomes, you're talking about the better defense. Those are three of the biggest key elements you can have in order to win a Super Bowl. And I think all three favor the Chiefs side of this game. And I loved, Matt knows this 2 weeks ago, actually more like 3 or 4, as you were saying now, we're trying to get a little space between us and this game, that when you make the Chiefs the underdog, you make them incredibly dangerous. And I think that is something that you have to keep in mind. When you are at the top of the mountain, and as a Patriots fan, I know this very well, it's very difficult. People are chasing you. They're chasing you. They're chasing you, right? And you're at the top. You got to beat off all of these people, kind of take your belt away from you, which is something Matt Stryker knows a lot about. But all of a sudden, when you make the Chiefs the underdog and you say they're not good enough, they're not the guy at the top of the mountain anymore, I think they start to play with a chip on their shoulder. I think you've seen this the last couple of weeks with this Chiefs team, and I think it makes them very dangerous in this game as well.
Davis, do you think the Chiefs were luckier or playing better over the last few weeks? Do you think that there was a lot of luck involved with some plays that they made against the Ravens, the weather with the Dolphins, or do you think they just simply are now who we thought they would be at the beginning of the season? It can't be both, right? Which one is it?
Honestly, I think it is it's luck in a way, but it is the removal of bad luck. Kadarius Toney has not been active to directly hand the ball into defenders' hands. Remember, that happened. Kadarius Toney was involved in 2 plays this season where the Chiefs would have just won the game had Kadarius Toney not been active, right? Where they would have just simply won. I mean, obviously, I think Pat has played about the best he's ever played the last 3 weeks. I think they got a little bit lucky that Todd Monken just lost his mind in that Baltimore Ravens game, just called really one of the most bizarre game plans I've ever seen, treating a 7-point deficit like it was a 20-point deficit in the second half of that Ravens-Chiefs game. Ultimately, I will say they kind of are who they thought they were. They're just, instead of getting bad breaks, they're just kind of riding that variance to just about even.
All right, so let's do this, gentlemen. Let's take our first time out here on Fantasy Sports Today. When we come back next, of course, we got plenty of Super Bowl coverage. In fact, 3 hours and 50 minutes left of Super Bowl coverage if you're keeping score at home. But we're going to go into some of the future in fantasy, talk about some free agents. And for those of you who are in dynasty leagues, we'll give you some help coming up next. It's Fantasy Sports Today here on SportsGrid, Super Bowl Sunday edition. The 4 of us will be back right after these messages. We'll go there.
.47 is one of the hardest numbers to beat, period, for an NFL football game. A lot of combinations that can fall 47. You decide. Of course, you're getting great two-way action. That's what you want as the book. You don't have to move the number. Right. Biggest game of the year is the easiest game to book in the world.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Super Bowl is set in Vegas. We get a rematch from just a few years ago.
The only consistency in the playoffs has been Travis Kelce.
Brock Purdy, back-to-back leads point 1 touchdown pass, right? He can't win MVP with 1 touchdown pass. I hate the Chiefs. but I bet on him.
This is going to be a game that is played inside a field goal now from a spread perspective.
All that matters is there's one game left, the big game.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Scoring 19.7 points per game, 13.1 rebounds, and 8.2 assists. How can a center that is top 50 in scoring, first in rebounding, 7th in assists, and 8th in field goal percentage not make the All-Star team? That is such a huge snub for Domantas Sabonis.
Betting above the rim, only on SportsGrid.
0 points scored in the fourth quarter of that Falcons Super Bowl, and the Niners were shut out.
Yep.
So in the two biggest games of the two Super Bowls, one as a coordinator, one as a head coach, he hasn't scored a single point in the fourth quarter. And I tell you what, if they don't, on Sunday, they're not winning the game, bro.
Exactly.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Welcome back to Fantasy Sports Today. Happy Super Bowl Sunday here on SportsGrid. Plenty of Super Bowl coverage coming up. We'll give our picks, our props, and everything that you can imagine here on the show. But before we talk about today, we're going to take a quick look at the future. And of course, that's a big part of fantasy these days. A lot of folks are going to be watching the Super Bowl with no interest whatsoever on who wins the game, but just simply hoping that their young guys stay healthy because they're playing in a dynasty league. And part of the conversation also is free agency, gentlemen. And Matt, I'll start off with you. As we head toward free agency, that is probably one of the most fun times of the year in the NFL when it opens up and players are already starting to sign with other teams. And certainly we're going to see a couple of quarterbacks that are going to be out potentially on the free agent market unless there's something on the side that I don't know about that's going to get worked out. Kirk Cousins is going to become a free agent at the end of the season today, tomorrow. Baker Mayfield, who had a great end to his season as well. And looking at the free agent market, Matt, and looking at the way that the season went out with all of these quarterbacks being hurt and all of these backup quarterbacks playing, I guess I would contend that not only is the quarterback position the most important position in all of sports, if you can get any of these quarterbacks to sign with you, I think you pay, and you pay again.
Yeah, and you did a great job of setting it up with those two names because Joe and I often speak about how the league is changing. And at the beginning of the season, Joe and I also maybe bemoaned, if you will, the uncertainty of the youth at the position. So I'm glad that you mentioned Cousins, a guy that I think that any team that signs him, he will immediately bring them to that level of patience that you need, especially as a wagerer. There's a lot of youth. Which quarterback is going to be calm and patient, and instead of trying to force a play, just keep the ball? These are the things that you need the veteran presence of a guy like Cousins to instill in an organization. Then you mentioned a guy like Baker Mayfield. There's always going to be that X factor, that intangible, that off of the heap, if you will. So from the wagering perspective, looking forward, where these quarterbacks go is going to be a part of a much larger conversation, Craig.
Yeah, and Joe, I would guess in June or, when the free agent market opens up, Joe, I would guess we will probably look at the contracts financially for Cousins and Mayfield and be shocked as to how much money they're going to end up getting paid. But we probably shouldn't be at this point, again, given the nature of the position.
Well, you took the words out of my mouth. Number one, why should we be shocked? Because if you watch some of the quarterback play the last 2 years, the inexperience that we knew we were going to deal with coming into this season, you had a ton of rookies, a ton of first-year starters in the league. Guys were in the second, contract for them. it's just kind of crazy to think about how bad some of that play was at times. We were down to the second and third string quarterback, sometimes even fourth, sometimes even guys signed off the couch like Joe Flacco. So thank goodness that worked out for the Cleveland Browns. Don't get me wrong, but I don't think you can expect that. So for Kirk Cousins, especially that first guy off the board you're talking about, I think that the Vikings are going to move on. I can think that looking at the draft where they're currently positioned, a guy like J.J. McCarthy would kind of slot in for them very well, would give them a lot more cap space to kind of spread the money around. I'm curious what Davis thinks about this too, but Kirk Cousins is a guy that could fit really well with a team that is basically locked and loaded and just needs a quarterback like the Atlanta Falcons. If you put Kirk Cousins into that situation, I think that could be a very quick turnaround for that Falcons offense. It was very disappointing last year and frankly has been, but they have a ton of talent with Robinson, with Drake London, with Kyle Pitts, who just seem completely underutilized. You drop in a veteran presence like him, I think that changes the dynamic very quickly of the Falcons.
Davis,
it will definitely.
when you look at the – go ahead. You got it.
It will definitely change the dynamic. I just got so excited thinking about Kirk Cousins being on the Atlanta Falcons. We've slogged through the wilderness with Marcus Mariota and Desmond Ridder and Taylor Heineke throwing the ball to Kyle Pitts and Drake London. We barely got to see Bijan Robinson get up to full speed last year until the end. Finally, they started kind of taking the reins off. I think ultimately, sadly, what we are going to see with Kirk Cousins, and I have searched high and low for someone to say the opposite of this. I think he probably is either going to play on a 1-year huge deal for Minnesota, 1 year, $52 million, or the franchise tag for the Minnesota Vikings, because J.J. McCarthy, I think, makes perfect sense for Minnesota. But I think, sadly, what's going to happen is some team is going to trade up to 3 to select Jaden Daniels. I don't think he is going to go to the New England Patriots. And then I think another team might have to trade up to either Tennessee's pick or actually Atlanta's pick in order to select J.J. McCarthy. And we might see the Minnesota Vikings get leapfrogged there. And Baker, I would be willing to bet this, actually, and we're starting to see some of the sites offer this. Baker is going to sign with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and he's probably going to get a pretty good contract. And I, by the way, I love it because Baker, he tore his labrum, played through the second half of the season for the Browns, and then they just threw him away, basically. And I do love the idea that the Browns they have the worst contract in the NFL on their books because they moved away from Baker Mayfield too quickly.
Yeah, well, me and Matt Stryker, we've moved on to the third reliever on the Pittsburgh Pirates, and I'm sure that Davis and Joe are looking already at the free agent market in fantasy football. And so back to you here for a second, Davis, and then let's go to Joe. Where does this free agent market stack up? Because here I am doing a show with you fellas, and I'm seeing Michael Pittman, T. Higgins, and Mike Evans as the primary free agent wide receivers. Davis, that tells me this is weak, I guess. Is that really where we're at? Is this going to be a weak free agent fantasy market?
Yeah, honestly, free agency in the NFL is just kind of weak now. You never really let your great players get to free agency until they get to an age where you wouldn't feel that great about re-signing them, right? So Mike Evans is heading into his age 30 season. T. Higgins, honestly, if the Bengals had the cap maneuverability, they already would have signed him. But the Bengals just drafted too well, Craig. They're having to pay the piper for Jamar Chase, Joe Burrow, and T. Higgins kind of all at once. There are some cap projections out there that would have those 3 players accounting for 40% of the Bengals salary cap as a whole if they all got what their market rate was. It's just kind of untenable. So what's going to happen, Craig, is T. Higgins is about to sign with a team that is not the Bengals for money that is going to make your eyes bleed. People are not going to believe the contract that T. Higgins is going to get this offseason.
Yeah, I'm going to believe that. I believe that T. Higgins is going to sign a huge contract as well. I'm right there with Davis. I think that it would make a lot of sense for Michael Pittman and for the Colts to just get the franchise tag for this year and see Pittman with Anthony Richardson. Let's build up that Pittman stock again because, no offense to Gardner Minshew, Richardson is a special talent that could completely just destroy the game if everything breaks right for him. He's got incredible arm, incredible athleticism, size, speed. He's got the total package. He just needs to develop a little bit. So Pittman, I think, will end up back with Shane Steichen, who is, I think, one of the best young head coaches in the NFL. And I think that's proven because once he left Philadelphia, we all know what happened to that offense, don't we? Higgins earmarked for a big deal. I could see a Mike Evans just latching on with a Chiefs or with a contending team just to get there for one more run. My only concern with Baker Mayfield, and I don't know if you share this, is that when you have Dave Canales, who was that offensive coordinator that really sort of built him back, and maybe he needed some humbling, I don't know, but Baker Mayfield finally figured it out. He played pretty well this year. I would say an above average fantasy quarterback and above average NFL quarterback this season for the most part. And I think that's something you have to look at and say, okay, can he repeat it now that the guy who helped him get back on track is now somewhere else as a head coach? So that's a big question. And if you take Mike Evans away, what does it look like as well? So Baker Mayfield was a great return. But again, you saw that with Geno Smith one year. It fell back. Does the same thing happen this year coming up with Baker Mayfield? I think that's a huge question that looms for him in free agency potentially.
Matt, we got a minute to go. Do you think Mike Evans at this stage of his career, he's 30 years old, does he go along the lines of, Jerry Rice and Randy Moss, who, carve out second or third careers, or does he go along the lines of Julio Jones, where the age hits him and it's just over?
Great.
Which one?
It's a great question. If Mayfield goes back to Tampa, I could see Evans going back there as a security blanket for Mayfield. But to Joe's point, I could also see him being Evans, riding it out in a contender into the sunset, Craig.
All right, fair enough. We'll take another timeout here on Fantasy Sports Today. Coming up next, it's the all 2023 fantasy football teams. We'll tell you who made the cut. Coming up next on our supersized edition of Fantasy Sports Today. We'll be back on SportsGrid on Super Bowl Sunday right after this.
.47 is one of the hardest numbers to beat, period, for an NFL football game. A lot of combinations that can fall 47. You decide. Of course, you're getting great two-way action. That's what you want as the book. You don't have to move the number. Right. Biggest game of the year is the easiest game to book in the world.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Super Bowl is set in Vegas. We get a rematch from just a few years ago.
The only consistency in the playoffs has been Travis Kelce.
Brock Purdy, back-to-back weeks throwing one touchdown pass, right? He can't win MVP with one touchdown pass. I hate the Chiefs, but I bet on him.
This is going to be a game that is played inside a field goal now from a spread perspective.
All that matters is there's one game left, the big game.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Scoring 19.7 points per game, 13.1 rebounds, and 8.2 assists. How can a center that is top 50 in scoring, first in rebounding, 7th in assists, and 8th in field goal percentage not make the All-Star team? That is such a huge snub for Domantas Sabonis.
Betting above the rim, only on SportsGrid.
0 points scored in the fourth quarter of that Falcons Super Bowl, and the Niners were shut out.
Yep.
So in the two biggest games of the two Super Bowls, one as a coordinator, one as a head coach, he hasn't scored a single point in the fourth quarter. I tell you what, if they don't, on Sunday, they're not winning the game, bro.
Exactly.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Welcome back to Fantasy Sports today on this Super Bowl Sunday. We got Craig Mish, that's me, along with Davis Maddock, Joe Pisapia, and Matt Stryker. Normally Joe and Matt on the Sunday morning edition, Davis, Craig on the Saturday morning edition. But I'm calling it supersized, this show here on this Sunday to get into everything happening in fantasy football. And of course, a lot of our focus is on the Super Bowl. So I will start off here with Matt Stryker here in the segment. Matt, you have certainly been a student and an observer to many a Super Bowl, I would guess. Probably 20 or 30 Super Bowls, maybe even more than that. I think I'm trying to think here. My first Super Bowl that I recall seeing was, boy, Davis, you may want to hide your ears here on this one. I think it was the Raiders and Seattle Seahawks in 1980. I believe that was the first one. Raiders end up winning the Super Bowl. And here we are, 20, 30, 40 years later. I don't know what it is. Matt, remember back in the day when you used to get together with all of your buddies for the Super Bowl? You'd have these little sheets of paper. You'd predict how many rushing yards the guy would get. Everyone would throw $5 in. And here we are. We can all bet on the Super Bowl now legally, right? It's crazy how times have changed.
You're making up Super Bowls, Mish. That the Seahawks weren't in the Super Bowl that year. What are you
making up Super Bowls?
What sort of
Steve Largent?
No, but I'm looking at 1980, and it's the Steelers and the Rams, for goodness sakes. What sort of Flintstone vitamins were you taking as a child?
81.
Okay, 81 Super Bowl. Checking. Yeah, okay. All right. Now that checks out. Philadelphia Eagles and the Raiders. Wrong birds. You had the wrong birds there.
Same thing.
Well, I think here's the point overall, gentlemen, is at least for me, amongst the many chair shots and other things I did, i.e. college, my memory is fuzzy. But what I do know is this, and to bring it all back to a conversation, Joe mentioned something and then Davis mentioned something at the top of the show. This becomes a very public thing. The Super Bowl has evolved into this event, this national holiday, if you will. And I joke with Joe often on our show, when my mom is aware of something in sports, that to me is a red flag. My ears go up because it tells me now this has become a very public thing. You were talking, Craig, very astutely about the movement in the lines. And if you think about it, all of that has to do with the fact that, air quotes, my mom is aware of the thing. Joe and Davis during the break were talking about their fandom for Taylor Swift. How much of that is coming into the handle? And I'm not making a joke. As a wagerer, you must be able to waddle through these murky waters, because that's all you can do. You can't swim, and find those one or two spots where you can maximize your profit instead of getting all caught up in Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce and oh my God and all this and all that. That's how I look at it today's Super Bowl, Craig.
Got it. Yeah. Joe, give me the most important piece of information for both sides, both the Chiefs and the 49ers, to come out with a win today. What happens for the 49ers? Build me that narrative that they win the game, and then build me the one for the Chiefs, and then Davis after you.
I will. First, a public apology to Ron Jaworski. I think is in order. Let's give him his flowers, too, for making it to the Super Bowl there in 81. On top of that, to Matt's point, before I get to yours, let's not forget about the MVP voting having a slice from the public. So Travis Kelce's number is really interesting. Just saying, if he scores a touchdown in this game, I have two teenage daughters. I can tell you who they're going to be voting for if they can. And I would say this, too, for this game here to go the way of the 49ers, I think you're looking at an over. So the number is 47.5. I think for them, it's crucial to get this game to an over and above their team total if they're going to have a chance to win. I don't think they want to be in a dogfight defensively here against the Kansas City Chiefs. And the Spagnuolo defense is something I think that we don't talk about enough. This is the best Chiefs defense they probably had in a Super Bowl. Snead has played out of his mind this year. I think you're in a position here where Brock Purdy is going to see a lot of unique blitzes, and Purdy is still kind of untested on this level. And at this point, guys, I keep looking at the 49ers team, and I'm trying to figure out why they're the favorite. They snuck through 2 games at home, and I mean snuck through. The Green Bay Packers should have won that football game. They had it in control. Purdy made a couple plays. They fell short late, and the Green Bay Packers still had a chance at the end to win that football game. That was coming off the bye at home. Then the first half of that game against the Detroit Lions, what happened? The Lions beat the pants off the 49ers for the first half of that game, and if Dan Campbell had any discipline as a coach, we're probably looking at the Lions in the Super Bowl right now. And if you keep looking back and back further about this 49ers team, the last big win they had was against the Eagles. And it turns out that wasn't as big as we thought it was because we found out who the Eagles were. And the last great team that they played was the Ravens from the AFC, who also took it to them at home and beat the crap out of them. So I'm trying to figure out why they're favorites, why they're the darling right now. I don't get it. Explain it to me like I'm a 5-year-old, Davis, because I just don't understand this reason of why the 49ers are all of a sudden the favorite in this game when you have all these other pieces here when it comes to the Kansas City Chiefs that seem like they are the better pieces.
Well, the 49ers are favored because, 2 through 58 on their roster, they are much better than the Kansas City Chiefs. They have the better offensive line. They're not missing any of their offensive linemen. Joe Thuney is not going to be playing in this game for the Kansas City Chiefs. The defense is not as good in the aggregate, but they have multiple players who would be probably the best player on the Kansas City Chiefs defense. Bosa, Fred Warner. They have great defensive backs. They're very well coached. I mean, this was the number 1 team in the regular season in offense. Any advanced metric you look at, EPA on both sides of the ball, DVOA from Football Outsiders, they're going to be the number 1 team. In fact, the 49ers in the regular season were the 3rd best team by team DVOA of all time in NFL history. All of that being said, I think we all know the reason why people are picking the Kansas City Chiefs in this game. Pat is not the greatest quarterback yet, but he's the best quarterback. No one has ever played as good as Mahomes for a sustained stretch the way he has. No quarterback has ever started their career playing in a conference championship every single year that they've played. Mahomes has 0 turnover-worthy plays in over 100 dropbacks in the postseason thus far. He has only been sacked twice, and one of those was at the end of the game when they were just wasting clock against the Baltimore Ravens. Brock Purdy has already thrown 2 interceptions in this postseason. He's had 5 throws on 70 dropbacks graded as turnover-worthy plays by Pro Football Focus and their graders. He has already been sacked more times this postseason than Patrick Mahomes, despite playing in 1 fewer game. It's really not rocket science. We do talk about public money here on the program quite a bit, and it's not that often that the thing that your buddy at the bar would say would be the same thing that the highest level of quantitative analysis would tell you, which would be one of these teams has Patrick Mahomes and one of these teams does not. And so, Craig, we've heard this line. I mean, if you've turned into any Super Bowl content this week, you've heard this line. Yeah, the 49ers are really good. They're probably the better team, but they don't have Patrick Mahomes. And I think what that analysis misses is that when you say one team is better, but the other team has the best player, well, actually the team with the best player is probably the best team because they have that player. And there's so much more analysis to get into, but ultimately from the highest level, from 20,000 feet, I think that is the simplest way to view this game.
And something else that I forget where I heard it, but it is sort of a fascinating dynamic. And we'll go around the room here, so to speak. And because again, with me sort of feeling that I'm sort of against you guys. I kind of think the 49ers are going to win here. But Matt, I'll start with you. If you were able on an alternate line with no juice, essentially minus 110, whatever it was, right, to get San Francisco +3 in this game, I want you guys to think about this for a minute. If you could get the 49ers +3 and you didn't have to pay minus 170 or minus 200, would you do it? Because if that is the case, then essentially what you all would be telling me is that the 49ers are going to win the game. Because generally speaking, when the line is so close like this, with a +1 or a -1, it's very odd for it to come down to, let's just say, a 1-point game or a 2-point game. We've been watching the NFL long enough to know that. 3, clearly the most key number in the history of the NFL. But if it is the case and it landed on 3, you would push anyway, right? So I guess that was something that I was thinking about this week, saying, you know something? You really have to just throw out the line here at this point if you thought it was going to be that close.
Yep, and we'll get on Joe's private jet and find a book that will take that number, and I'm probably sure we'll be able to find it. But to your point, because it is so close and it is so public, and I think later on we'll all be talking about our best bets, we all expect this thing to be within the margin of error, which for our mathematicians out there is 3. So yes, I would. I am with you, Craig, though. I think that San Francisco wins this game. Part of me wants them to win this game, but it happens on the field. And I think that if they can just To me, it's the Bosa matchup, and I'll lean on Davis here. I think it's Taylor that'll be on Bosa for most of the night. The Bosa matchup, if Mahomes is upright often, if that pocket stays complete often, then Kansas City wins this thing. But if early on we see that being a problem, and because when Mahomes gets out of the pocket, that's where problems are created. If we can see this thing stay structurally sound for San Francisco, Craig, I'm with you. They win, and yeah, give me those 3 points.
Guys, any opinion on it?
I do.
I
want
would
to
take it.
Go ahead, Savis. Go ahead.
I would just take it because I'm a nerd, and so if you offered me a line that was 50 cents better than what I was publicly, you'd be turning down free money to do it. But I would do it knowing that I would be rooting against myself to lose for being gutless and for being a coward and just being like, well, because the math says you have to take. Like, I would do it, but I wouldn't. Craig, I would not be happy with myself.
No, I'm good. I'll take it. To the other side, Chiefs all the way. Look, I'm not going to waver on this. I didn't waver the last 2 times the Chiefs were underdogs. I think they take it personally. I think they should take it personally. They do have the better coach. I mean, how many times have we seen Kyle Shanahan come up short in big games, mismanaged clock? I mean, all these intangible things. Like, I'm trying to paint this picture of how the San Francisco 49ers win, and I think it's just McCaffrey running the ball, and running it some more, because that's the big deficit there for KC. We'll find out. We come back. Who are the best of the best in 23? We'll tell you right here on FSB.
.47 is one of the hardest numbers to beat, period, for an NFL football game. A lot of combinations that can fall 47. You decide. Of course, you're getting great two-way action. That's what you want as the book. You don't have to move the number. Right. Biggest game of the year is the easiest game to book in the world.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Super Bowl is set in Vegas. We get a rematch from just a few years ago.
The only consistency in the playoffs has been Travis Kelce.
Brock Purdy, back-to-back weeks throwing 1 touchdown pass, right? He can't win MVP with 1 touchdown pass. I hate the Chiefs, but I bet on him.
This is going to be a game that is played inside a field goal now from a spread perspective.
All that matters is there's one game left, the big game.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Scoring 19.7 points per game, 13.1 rebounds, and 8.2 assists. How can a center that is top 50 in scoring, first in rebounding, 7th in assists, and 8th in field goal percentage not make the All-Star team? That is such a huge snub for Domantas Sabonis.
Betting above the rim, only on SportsGrid.
0 points scored in the fourth quarter of that Falcons Super Bowl, and the Niners were shut out.
Yep.
So in the 2 biggest games of the 2 Super Bowls, one as a coordinator, one as a head coach, he hasn't scored a single point in the fourth quarter. And I tell you what, if they don't, on Sunday, they're not winning the game, bro.
Exactly.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Welcome back to Fantasy Sports Today on SportsGrid. Our Super Bowl coverage continues here on FST. Craig Mish, Joe Pisapia, Matt Stryker, and Davis Maddock up until noon. We got coverage all the way through the kickoff of the Super Bowl and, of course, in-game live during as well on our big day today. Gentlemen, before we get to today, let's take a look back at the 2023 fantasy football season. For myself, playing in my Dynasty League, I captured a second championship. I did a bit, actually, the other day on the show. I won this league, Joe. You and I have talked about this previously, too, where I'm playing with all these ex-baseball players who just, have nothing to do and just, spend money. So I ended up winning the championship last year in this league. And this year I won again, and I didn't take the ring because I already had the ring from the year before. And so I just took the money. Yeah, I just took the money. Davis said I did the right thing in that spot. He said he would have done the same thing. So I feel good about that. But that was really my swan song in this league. I don't know if I could win 3 in a row. That would be crazy. But anyway, I digress. 30 seconds of wasted time here on the air. Let me.
Well, here's a question. Craig, I got a question for you. Are you just going to take the ring to the mall to like things remembered and just get the 2023 etched in it?
Things remembered.
And just continue
I
on?
could do that. You know what? I thought about it. I was
Sponsor
thinking of
the
actually
show, folks. Things remembered.
Yeah, I was thinking of actually, of like cutting it in half and then wearing it as earrings. Just going back and forth.
Craig Mish with the gauges. Davis, you'd approve of that, right? Just kind of, Craig Mish going a little hipster there as he approaches 50, perhaps. I don't know. We never know. We never know how old Craig Mish is. That's the beauty of Craig Mish. He never ages.
Matt, could I ask you a question?
Yeah. Hi, I'm here. Yes.
Yeah. True or false? I had 2 looped earrings in the past. True or false? What do you think?
True. Absolutely true.
True.
You're a hip hop kid.
True.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
True.
Yeah. That's
True.
fine. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that.
In college, I had both. No evidence of it, by the way. All right, Davis has a belly button ring, if I'm not mistaken. So let's go to him here for our 2023 All Fantasy Football Team. Davis, certainly you've been a huge advocate of Jalen Hurts from day one. I was doing shows with you. You were like, get this Wentz guy out of here, get this Jalen Hurts guy in here. And I know the season didn't end the way that he wanted to, but from a fantasy perspective, there's simply no denying that when drafts begin next year and you're looking at the first quarterback off the board, Hurts is going to be 1 or 2 without a doubt.
Yep, it was either him or Josh Allen. I just sided with Jalen Hurts for my all fantasy team because his highs were a little bit higher. He had a couple of games over 35 fantasy points, just delivering those absolute winning weeks for you. And also, Jalen Hurts got injured and was banged up a little bit, so you might have had, maybe you picked up C.J. Stroud, maybe you picked up Baker Mayfield, Brock Purdy there on the waiver wire at the end of the season. And for my all fantasy running backs, I did not take Kyren Williams. I left that one for Joe. But I think this Mostert season is going to be kind of like a historical trivia. It's going to be like something that fantasy football players remember 5 years from now. They're going to be like, wait, this 31-year-old running back for the Dolphins who ran track at Purdue and scored 21 touchdowns for the Miami Dolphins. I think it is really this unbelievable season. I also selected Travis Etienne instead of Christian McCaffrey. Obviously, McCaffrey was the fantasy MVP of the season. But the reason why I selected Etienne, one, he did have this 8-week stretch where he was the second best running back in fantasy behind only McCaffrey. But, people they've gotten a little bit too down on the Jaguars. So I kind of want to keep it to the forefront of everyone's memory just how good the Jaguars were when they were healthy before Trevor Lawrence. By the end of the season, Trevor Lawrence was just like a zombie. I could barely get out of bed in the morning and was still playing for the Jaguars. No debate here amongst the wide receivers. Puka Nacua, Mike Evans, and Deebo Samuel. All these guys crushed the slots that they were drafted in for ADP. Nacua, ultimately, I think is what the 2023 fantasy football season is going to be remembered for because he's going to be in our lives for a long time. I don't necessarily know if that same thing is true about Kyren Williams. He is going to go very early in fantasy football drafts in 2024, but long term, I'm betting 3-4 years from now, we're still taking Nacua in the second round of our fantasy drafts, and that will not be true for Kyren Williams. Debo, I mean, look, if any of you had Debo at the end of the year when he was doing his Debo thing, 3 touchdowns on 7 touches, you know how awesome it was to have him on your fantasy team. Mike Evans was drafted in like the deadest range in 2023. I mean, you go back and look at ADP in the 6th round, the 7th round, the 8th round of fantasy drafts, you're looking at a bunch of guys who did absolutely nothing for your fantasy team, just got like injuries, poor performance, bench, like whatever, just absolutely the worst. And Mike Evans totally carried your teams in those spots. And there's really, I mean, come on. Sam Laporta, number 1 overall scoring tight end as a rookie, just like unbelievable how important he was for fantasy teams. And again, the same thing with the Dallas Cowboys. They didn't end the year super out, although they did score, I think, 21 fantasy points in week 17. They were absolutely massive if you had them there. But they had all of those pick sixes from Deron Bland, and they had those multiple games with like 5-6 sacks. They were clearly, I think, the best fantasy defense, Craig.
Yeah. Look, that was the key to a lot of the season. Now, Joe, I think Davis brings up a really good point on a couple of levels, and then I want to go to you for your team. I mean, Puka Nacua had a generational season in the sense that once every 5-10 years in fantasy football, there's a player that's on no one's radar that ends up being one of the MVPs of the fantasy season. But what's interesting, Joe, is on his own team, he had a player at running back that you really almost could put in that same category. I mean, the Rams had 2 players that were not being discussed a lot on draft day that ended up carrying teams at least to the fantasy championship. You never know what can happen in the fantasy championship. I'm not going to say they won it. But Nacua, of course, at the wide receiver position, and I know you want to highlight Williams at the running back position.
Yeah, look, Puka Nacua, the waiver wire pickup of the year, arguably, along with Kyren Williams' teammate, which is something you don't see very often. You're 100% correct. But good job by the Rams front office, too, a team that does not have a lot of draft picks typically going in, making the most of it and selecting Puka Nacua. And Matt Stryker can attest to this. Nobody was talking about Puka Nacua except one guy, and we had him on the show every single week, and that was Derek Brown. Derek Brown from Fantasy Pros came on every week on our show on Sundays, and he told everybody before the season started, pick up Puka Nacua. Pick him up right now. He's going to be the guy. And then in week 1, people was like, oh, my God, what a great first game for him. Can we buy into it? And some people still didn't. It was crazy. But if you look at that list of Davis's players, too, Mostert is that guy that you just can't chase it. I did a whole segment on it last week with Matt. You can't chase the Mostert productivity. It is a system that is going to be very beneficial for running backs. It's high octane. It's high pace. Somebody else is probably going to do it next year. Is it Achane? Probably. We'll find out. But it's a great list. Mike Evans, I think that's the one I'll take the L on because I was not chasing any Tampa Bay Buccaneers guys at all. I was very skeptical of what Baker Mayfield could do. Rachaad White turned out to be a really good value. Mike Evans turned out to be a great value. So in that dead spot, as Davis was alluding to, Mike Evans and even some of those other Tampa Bay Buccaneers pieces, even Baker Mayfield and Superflex turned out to be a pretty good investment, which was pretty surprising. Now, my team looks a little different. I got to the list first, so I got to take some bigger names. Let's just be honest. When you make up the show sheet, you get to the names first. So Davis did an outstanding job of picking out some other guys there. But for me, Josh Allen at the top at quarterback, 3 more fantasy points per game than Jalen Hurts. Also, the Hurts down the stretch, not quite that great, unfortunately, so that hurt a little bit. Christian McCaffrey, I mean, what more can you say about Christian McCaffrey? 21 touchdowns. He was the 49ers' go-to guy all season long. He's been incredible. What a trade that they were able to make a few years ago to bring in Christian McCaffrey. The Panthers' whole evaluation system needs an overhaul. Let me tell you, the last couple of years have not gone well for the Carolina Panthers in trades, in draft. Story for another show. Kyren Williams, again, when you're talking about a player who can finish as RB4 in half-point PPR and only play 12 games, that's astounding. Now, it tells you where running back has been in 2023, which is through the mud, but still an incredible season, over 1,100 yards rushing. He had 32 receptions as well, 15 touchdowns for Kyren Williams. He was a big part of that resurgence of the Rams in 2023. CeeDee Lamb off the charts. Is he the number 1 guy going into next year? He might be. I keep trying to knock Christian McCaffrey off that pedestal, and every year McCaffrey keeps stuffing it down my throat. So that's fine. I get it, CMC. I respect it. But CeeDee Lamb was the most traded piece in fantasy football in the first 5 weeks of the season. And if you traded for CeeDee Lamb, you did well, because at the end of the day, this guy went off and had one of the best fantasy seasons we've ever seen from a wide receiver. It was a tremendous second half for him, or even 2/3 of a season when you really get down to it. 1,700 receiving yards and 14 touchdowns for him. Tyreek Hill started off red hot, faded a little bit with some injuries down the stretch. Amon-Ra St. Brown, as steady as it goes, and I can't wait to dig a little deeper into him. And Davis did a great job taking Sam Laporta at tight end. Rookie tight ends can be great. We saw it with Kyle Pitts a couple years ago. He didn't have the touchdowns, but he had the yardage. That's what we care about in the receptions. Hopefully he gets back on track. We saw Laporta this year. We saw Dalton Kincaid this year. You saw Musgrave this year. You saw a lot of these guys really start to pop. And I think that is shaking off the dust to, not to mention Trey McBride, right? Another guy who was really kind of his first year, even though he was a second-year player, his first year really playing. I think you're seeing a difference here. And I think now Brock Bowers coming into this draft, we'll talk about later in the show. The whole rookie tight ends can't be useful in fantasy. I think that notion is dead, and we can leave it in the dust. I took the Baltimore Ravens at the defense, although the Dallas Cowboys that Davis took did have some higher peaks. They were a little up and down sometimes, whereas Baltimore just a little steadier. But Amon-Ra St. Brown's the guy I want to highlight, because if you're looking for consistency, especially in a PPR league, I mean, he might be the best value on the board going into next year. There's a good chance, you're going to rattle off the CMC, CeeDee Lamb, Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase names, right? We're already almost 5-6 deep. So in the middle of the first round, this guy is going to be there, Amon-Ra St. Brown, with his 119 receptions last year, with 164 targets, with 1,500 receiving yards and 10 touchdowns. Davis, I got to get your opinion on this, because I feel like Amon-Ra St. Brown, despite the fact he is up in that elite tier, still doesn't get the respect he deserves. Do you feel that way too? Like, people don't talk about him in that best wide receiver in the NFL or in fantasy conversation as much as they maybe should?
I mean, they definitely don't. I think it's honestly maybe even like a little bit of a stylistic thing. Kind of the way that he wins is not nearly as eye-popping as the way a Justin Jefferson or a Jamar Chase or a Tyreek Hill wins. It's exactly what you said. It's a lot of consistency. It's a lot of 13 for 102, 6 for 108, 7 for 112, 6 for 90. It's a lot of iterative stat lines. I think the comp that I've always had for fantasy, not necessarily exactly the same way that they play, is that he reminds me a lot of Keenan Allen. And I have never been a Keenan Allen guy in fantasy, obviously, which this last season, until he got injured, seemed stupid. He had the best fantasy game. I believe he had the single highest fantasy point game of any wide receiver in a game this most recent season. And, part of it also is, like, I think a little bit of Jared Goff and Lions disrespect as well. It's a little bit about not believing there. But I think you do make a great case for why he is amongst one of the 5-6 best wide receivers in fantasy football overall.
Yeah. Real quick, Matt, before we break for this segment here, Joe highlighted Amon-Ra St. Brown. Do you think the Lions are legit going into next year, no matter what, Matt, their offense continues?
It continues as long as a lot of these same guys' personnel returns and coaches make some different decisions, Greg.
All right, fair enough. We'll take a quick timeout. When we come back next, Davis gives his favorite bet from the Super Bowl, and then we got 3 more hours to go. So make sure you stay with us on the supersized edition of FST Fantasy Sports Today.
.47 is one of the hardest numbers to beat, period, for an NFL football game. A lot of combinations that can fall 47. You decide. Of course, you're getting great two-way action. That's what you want as the book. You don't have to move the number. Right. Biggest game of the year is the easiest game to book in the world.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Super Bowl is set in Vegas. We get a rematch from just a few years ago.
The only consistency in the playoffs has been Travis Kelce.
Brock Purdy, back-to-back weeks throwing one touchdown pass, right? He can't win MVP with one touchdown pass. I hate the Chiefs, but I bet on them.
This is going to be a game that is played inside a field goal now from a spread perspective.
All that matters is there's one game left, the big game.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Scoring 19.7 points per game, 13.1 rebounds, and 8.2 assists. How can a center that is top 50 in scoring, first in rebounding, 7th in assists, and 8th in field goal percentage not make the All-Star team? That is such a huge snub for Domantas Sabonis.
Betting above the rim, only on SportsGrid.
0 points scored in the fourth quarter of that Falcons Super Bowl, and the Niners were shut out.
Yep.
So in the two biggest games of the two Super Bowls, one as a coordinator, one as a head coach, he hasn't scored a single point in the fourth quarter. And I tell you what, if they don't, on Sunday, they're not winning the game, bro.
Exactly.
It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
Welcome back to Fantasy Sports Today. Some of the very peculiar bets that are over on the FanDuel Sportsbook, DraftKings, BetMGM, very bettable right now. In fact, as I look here at the FanDuel Sportsbook, an interesting prop, expletives by Davis Maddock during the Super Bowl, 8.5. Very interesting number there. I don't know if I would go over or under, but Davis, I know that you have a favorite wager going into Sunday's game. What is it?
Well, I'm watching the game with my in-laws, so I don't know. Depending on the line, if you get some juice to the under, I would take the under on that. But it is going to be high stress. I do have my best bet for this game. It is going to be Patrick Mahomes over 4.5 rushing attempts. If you shop around a little bit, you should be able to find that right around -125. Pretty simple here. Not really breaking any ground. This is let's be honest, guys. This is everyone's favorite wager. One, you can definitely just get it in the course of a regular game. Mahomes in his career has just run far more often in the postseason. He has 81 rushing attempts in 17 career postseason games. So he runs significantly more in the postseason. But of course, you have the outs that if they win this game, you are then getting the kneel down attempts. You also could have them, they have the ball 3 seconds left in the first half. He takes a kneel down there. It probably should just be shaded a little bit more towards the over. But really what we're leaning on here is I don't think the 49ers are going to blitz Mahomes all that often. And if he is not facing that pressure, and with these wide receivers, I think he's just going to take a lot of 4-5 yard gains when they're there, when he gets outside of the pocket. I think he gets over this number pretty easily. Patrick Mahomes over 4.5 rushing attempts.
All right, so there you go. One of many Super Bowl props we're going to talk about here on this edition of Fantasy Sports Today. That'll do it for our first hour of the show. If you're just tuning in, we got 3 more hours to go. How will we do it? I got my buddies here along for the ride. So stick with us. More Fantasy Sports Today coming up, 9 a.m. Eastern, right around the corner here on SportsGrid. We'll be right back.